Hello, welcome to another devotional from the letter of James. We're in chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. Two kinds of wisdom. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbour bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. This is the final section of chapter 3. We were thinking in verses 1 to 12 about our words, but now we're on the theme of wisdom. We'll see a contrast between earthly and heavenly wisdom. But it's not such a different subject. If you look again at the kind of language James uses, that'll give a clue as to what's in his mind. So when he writes about wisdom, he writes about humility in verses 13 and 14, about envy and selfish ambition in our hearts, about boasting and denying the truth. So again, you see the connections being built up. Our heart attitudes will show themselves in our words, which will then issue in actions. And chapter 3 has been warning us that our words will do harm unless they arise from a godly heart. So we're back in heart territory. Verse 13 sets out the aim: wisdom, understanding, a truly good life. You may remember in a previous study I said that James in a way is the New Testament equivalent of the Old Testament wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and so on. And here we see something of that classic antithesis between wisdom and folly, righteous and the wicked, the godly and the ungodly. And maybe James is echoing what some of his readers were saying, that they have good understanding and they're wise. But he says godly wisdom is never seen just in words, some kind of sage or oracle dispensing wise sayings. If there's true wisdom, let's see the fruit of it in a good life, good deeds, displaying true humility towards God and towards others. That challenge about humility will come to its climax in chapter 4, verse 6. God opposes the proud, but shows favour to the humble. So there's verse 13, sets out the aim. And now in verses 14 to 18, we get this kind of checklist of a contrast, what earthly so-called wisdom will look like and what heavenly wisdom will be like when it's at work. So let's take a closer look at those. And you notice, first of all, in verses 14 and 16, where he's talking about earthly wisdom, he links envy and selfish ambition. They come in both those verses, 14 and 16. Well, what are they? Sometimes envy and jealousy are used as interchangeable words, sometimes even in translations. Both of them involve looking at someone else and what they have. If there is a distinction in meaning, it perhaps would be this, that envy is where someone has something that you want, you're coveting, and you're envious of their possessions, their appearance, their circumstances, their personality, whatever it is. How is it that her hair always looks so beautiful? Why is he surrounded by people all the time? Why does she get all the interesting jobs? Whereas jealousy is more often focused on the person themselves, a feeling maybe of competing with someone else, being put down or betrayed by a rival, typically, of course, in matters of love. So I wonder if maybe selfish ambition is a little bit more like jealousy. I want to be first in the queue. Why should I just get what's left over? I'm better than he is. I ought to get that job. And in verse 14, we see what's going on in our hearts. And verse 16, the consequences in our actions. And then sandwiched between the two in verse 15, there's a reminder that in the spiritual realm, we may be unaware of this or just ignore it. But remember, James said in chapter 3, verse 6, an uncontrolled tongue is like an agent of hell itself. And here his language is no less stark. The wisdom that involves envy and selfish ambition is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. And then verses 17 to 18, heavenly wisdom. Thankfully, there is an alternative. And we see here the characteristics of this heavenly wisdom. Let me just pick out 4 things for you. The first is that there's a theme of purity through these verses. Heavenly wisdom is first of all pure. Remember James spoke in our last section about a spring producing salt water, which is both unnatural and unhealthy. Heaven produces things, however, which are not only right and holy, but lovely and pure. So this is like the good life that's described in verse 13. And we've had this before in chapter 1, verse 27, the idea of keeping yourself from being polluted by the world. So that's the first theme, purity. Then secondly, you'll notice that the qualities that are outlined here have very much the idea of humility at their centre. A humble person will seek peace and be considerate towards everyone. They will want to be submissive to others, to be impartial, to be sincere. And anyone with a right estimate of themselves will be full of mercy towards others. So purity, humility. And then there's the idea, thirdly, of bearing good fruit. Do you remember in chapter 1, it was the word of truth that makes us like the first fruits of God's creation. Our actions will show what's in our hearts. It's a bit like Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, by their fruit you will know them. And then fourthly, in verse 18, the kind of concluding summary of all this uses a similar idea. Peacemakers who sow in peace will reap a harvest of righteousness. And let me just add one little footnote to this. If this passage, this whole letter is written indeed by James, the brother of Jesus, who became the leader of the Jerusalem church, if you were to look at Acts 15 another time, it gives a fine example of peacemaking. There was a potentially divisive issue outlined in the first 12 verses between Christians of a Jewish and of a Gentile background. And then in verse 13 it says this, when they had finished having their debate and discussion, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. And then he kind of summarises the points that have been made, quotes some Bible passages, and then concludes. And clearly the church reached some kind of agreement, because it says at the end, then the apostles and elders, together with the whole church, decided about the letter they were sending. So we might say peacemaking is a necessary quality for spiritual leaders, perhaps especially in the local church. And let's remember too, this peacemaking, this wisdom, is the fruit of God's Spirit. Love, joy, peace, and so much more. And maybe most of all, when we think of heavenly wisdom, we might see these as simply a description of Jesus himself. Pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Jesus was the ultimate peacemaker who sowed in peace and reaped a harvest of righteousness. We read in Colossians 1 that God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Well, wisdom is a huge subject, and the Bible's full of it. But let me leave you with just a couple of specific questions to help think and discuss further. First of all, negatively, thinking of some of those aspects that are only earthly, sinful, even demonic in their nature, my question would be this: how can we put to death the envy and selfishness that are so deep-seated in our fallen nature? Are there ways that we can think or speak or act that will lead us away from those hindrances and will bring a change of heart? And then secondly, more positively, what kind of things do we especially need heavenly wisdom for? Maybe think of examples when you've said to yourself, I simply don't know what to do. And turning to God for help and asking for wisdom is the best thing to do. In other words, picking up that invitation that James gave in chapter 1, verse 6. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously. What kind of circumstances lead you especially to need this heavenly wisdom?